Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sculptform webinar, Space Orienting to Place, the Melbourne Airport Journey. This is a project that we wanted to discuss for a very long time, but obviously we have been held up with the Melbourne Airport not being accessible so much. We have decided to go ahead with the event because it is quite a landmark project, and hopefully it won't be too long before we're able to access the project and see it in person. Now, before we commence, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to their elders past and present. So for our event today, just take you through the agenda. I will start off by just introducing Sculptform and how it relates to wayfinding, how it relates to our work. I will then pass you over to my colleague Kalani, who works as a Melbourne Business Development Manager and Project Manager and has worked on Melbourne Airport for quite a few months. And she will introduce our main presenters who have kindly agreed to come and share their knowledge with us today, our presenters from Grimshaw. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. So we encourage you to place us in a questions tab. Now, the advantage that we have of doing these presentations digitally and not in studio as we normally would is we do get a lot of interstate guests, a lot of international guests. So please use the chat bar and let us know where you're from. We like to connect, even if it's just while chat. But if you are asking questions, as I said, please use the questions tab, is just make sure that we don't miss it. And we also do draw out a lucky draw prize for those people asking questions, which is a box of something delicious with a bottle of something equally as delicious and probably containing bubbles. So we'll draw that at the end. So if you're asking questions, just make sure that you stick around to it. So a little bit of background about Sculptform. We're an Australian manufacturer of feature walls in ceiling systems, with our manufacturing facility based in Bendigo, but we work with designers and main contractors all over the world. And our products are often found in high traffic areas and public areas. And thus we've been involved with several projects where products become quite a significant element for orientation and wayfinding. And this is because such features as linear directional forms that can be created with the use of modular pattern systems and the possibilities with integration with lighting and signage. And of course, the tactile nature of timber, which adds warmth and creates a strong emotional connection with the physical environment. And used appropriately, these elements can help to guide decisions, aid with destination recognition, enhance user experience, and help with safety and crowd control. Before we move to main presenters, I also just wanted to highlight a few projects where this has been executed and done quite well as well. So, for example, Vision Australia, offices designed by Hot Black and ECM Group, and this is where a concept of using opposing orientations is applied to its full effect. And the architects on this project needed to understand and adopt the requirements of the Vision Australia workforce, which includes 240 visually impaired employees. And the design solution encompassed many facets of assistance throughout the space. And it was imperative that the design took into consideration contrasting colours so they could easily identify as to where the walls and floors met, where paths of travel were, and to easily identify potential objects. And over the ceiling, aluminium battens, powder coating in black and white, run in different directions, highlighting certain areas of interest. A particular feature emphasized with this method is the presentation area, where contrasting colors create subconscious division between areas of open plan office. Another interesting case study is the Blackfriars Primary School in South Australia, a redevelopment by Swinbury Penglaze Architects to refresh the school learning environment, now known as the Aquinas Centre. The centre houses STEM learning environments such as science laboratories, tech studies facilities, project rooms, and isolated think tank areas. It also houses general classrooms for the school with modern and high-tech fixtures and fittings. And a showpiece of the school design is a large, beautiful winding staircase leading to the first floor. It was chosen to be lined with spotted gum to provide durable and safe walkway for the students to flow through between classes. It was designed to have a wide entrance at the bottom, and that narrows as you climb to the top, helping to slow foot traffic and open up to the area. And lighting and signage were carefully designed and integrated with the timber patterns throughout, which was a key design aspect of the architectural team, with the navigation throughout the building. And lastly is the recently opened, or probably not so recent now, I believe it was the start of the year, is Ganyama Park and Aquatic Centre, a world-class facility where the community can catch up with friends and family, enjoy some quiet time in the open air pool, and get into some serious exercise. A collaboration between Andrew Burgess Architects, Grimshaw, and Landscape Architects, TCL. Being the largest pool complex built in Sydney for more than 20 years and with a cost of $100 million, was a considerable investment for the community. And this beautiful, functional, sustainably designed building is much more than an aquatic centre. The complex includes a combination of 5 pools, a large health and fitness centre, and a park, including sporting field, outdoor gym, and recreational areas. And a visual connection guide visitors from exterior to exterior and space to space. So the spatial planning and wayfinding feels easy and natural. There are few direct lines of travel, and yet there's often a visual connection between where you are and where you want to be. And I think I'll leave it there as a short introduction on some of the projects. You can, of course, get more information on our website for these projects and others if you're looking for some inspiration. But for now, I will pass you over to Kalani.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Kate, for introducing those projects. I think it creates a really great scene. So I think it's really important to identify the integral role that wayfinding has in design, and how these elements don't just happen by coincidence. They are well thought out by designers and consultants. So I'm not going to pretend to be an expert here, but what I do want to do is have a look at the Melbourne Airport and some of the areas where wayfinding products have been integrated within our Sculptform system. So when designing our feature products, we aim for products that not only look great, but can also aid in the overall functionality of the space. And so how this relates to wayfinding in particular is through signage and lighting. So that's what I'll take you through today. So signage is the most visual part of wayfinding. There's 4 types of signage that are most commonly used to help users navigate through a space and also give them appropriate information. So first we have informational signage, which provides useful information for a place in which a user is. So for an example, operation hours of, say, a cafe. You then have directional signage, which is rather self-explanatory. However, this is signage that directs users with arrows saying which space to go for which purpose. We then have identification signage, which helps the user understand where they are. It's most commonly put on an entrance of the building per se, and it allows users to understand that that's, say, the arrival point of the destination. And then lastly, we have regulatory signage, which allows people to know what they can and can't do in a space. Prime example of this one is your no smoking signs. So I have 2 different signage examples that have been used at the airport here. So these are kind of examples. So on the left-hand side, we have the toilet, which is the example of an identification sign. And on the right-hand side, we have your directional signage showing to go up the escalator for a particular purpose. So without getting into too much detail, there are a number of ways to integrate signage within our Sculptform system. And I think these 2 do a really great job of kind of demonstrating the 2. So firstly, for the toilet application, you are looking at a product that actually is integrated within the timber battens. And how this is done is it's the routing out of the timber, allowing for the signage, and in this case, an acrylic product, to actually be inserted into that section that's been routed out, and allow for the signage to be flush with the face of the battens. On the right-hand side, we have signage that's actually been pinned to the front of the battens. And so what this does is means that the signage does slightly protrude past the battens, but it's really great in a format where your sign is quite thin in orientation, and it's much easier from kind of an installation process for bigger signs like that. So a good wayfinding program doesn't rely on signage alone. Where possible, it's important to rely on landmarks, pathways, architectural, lighting features, and other environmental cues to facilitate intuitive navigation. So light in particular is an effective way of showing us where to go. It essentially draws us in and leads us through to a destination. And it's really great advantage of lighting when it's well placed is that you can see it from quite a distance. So really great for large format applications like the airport. So I have a few examples that have been used at the airport designed by Grimshaw. So firstly, we have the integration of downlights. In the most part, from an application point of view, this is just stopping and starting your battens, allowing for that light fixture to be fixed in between. So this example is great because the downlights work from a functionality perspective in lighting up that luggage storage area, but it also works to kind of allow for that area to be seen from quite a distance away, and it lights up that space. This example here is integration of linear lights. So this can be done in a number of ways. So you can have your linear lights that actually sit in between the timber battens and in the spacing, which is what's being done at the airport. Or alternatively, you can actually get rid of one of the timber battens in your sequence and replace it with your light fixture, which is more the example on the right. I wanted to flag this example because I think it does a really great job at kind of pointing your attention to a particular position, which is where it's pointing you towards the elevator or this exit point as well. And lastly, we have the iconic Melbourne light. Now this one's a mixture of an identification signage, but with the integration of lighting. So I think this guy's a great example of drawing your attention to a particular position and letting you know where you are. Quite frankly, this one's really hard to miss. And in this application, it's very similar to the recessed signage that we talked about a little bit earlier, where the battens have been routed out to allow for the light to be inlaid. So that one's a really awesome one. So I'll now pass over to our Grimshaw speakers, Mr. Dean Lathman and Melgazadi Haley. So they are going to take you through a case study of the airport. So Dean is an expert in designing and delivering large, complex projects, finely tuned to suit their purpose and reflect the unique sense of place. So he's led several infrastructure projects in Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And that includes the Melbourne Airport, which he's been working on since he moved to Melbourne in 2015. And then we have Gosha, who is highly skilled in resolving planning and design issues and navigating stakeholder and client engagement for complex public projects with experience across extensive variety of sectors, including aviation, rail, transport, commercial, research, and health. Gosha is adept in designing exceptional and high functional spatial experiences. So thank you, Dean and Gosha.
Thank you, Kalani and Kate, for having us both.
Hello.
I'll just share the screen. Just bear with me a second. Okay, I'll just start off by just giving you a brief overview of the project. Thanks, Kalani, for going into more technical details with regards to the battening system, but we wanted to kind of step out of that and look at more about the kind of the journey that we've had on the airport, the kind of the design iterations and progression that we've created on the project. And I'll take you through some of the kind of the early and big moves of the project, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Gosha, who will take you through some of the craft and detailing passenger experience, and then I'll take you back through the construction and completion of the project. But before we wanted to talk about the Melbourne Airport journey, we felt it'd be good to talk about our journeys as well. And as you can probably tell by our names and our accents, that we're not originally from Melbourne and we're not originally from Australia. And I was personally, and I'm from a place called Shrewsbury in the UK. It's 9th century medieval market town. It was the birthplace of Charles Darwin, which is quite a big shout for the town. But I was born and bred there, and moved to Liverpool to study and to live and follow my favourite Liverpool football club. and eventually moved down to London, where I joined Grimshaw, and have worked on many projects while I've been at Grimshaw. I've been there for 10 years now, and so these are just a selection few of the projects that I've worked on and that have been built. So working in the education sector, working in the rail sector, working in aviation, and added in a couple of images there from projects I've done at Melbourne Airport.
Hi, my name is Gosha Haley, full name it's Margaret Haley. I'm Associate Principal at Grimshaw. Polish. I came to Australia via London. So I come from this small town in the north of Poland called Koszalin. It's been quite heavily destroyed during the war, so most of the architecture is new. I grew up there and then studied in Gdańsk, and after my first 3 years of university, I moved to London and started with Grimshaw in 2000. And I worked on in a variety of different sectors, Kalani said earlier, but this 6 are probably my most major projects, and actually probably the only ones that actually have been delivered, because we work on such a big number of speculative jobs. But so the first one is the UCLA London Research Facility, then work on a factory of Rolls-Royce in Chichester. I had the pleasure to work on Eden project in Cornwall. And here in Melbourne, I've delivered the Doherty Institute for Melbourne University, and obviously the T2 arrivals. In the last 2 years, I work on the City Rail link in Auckland, which is a really amazing project too. So, yeah.
Thanks, Gosha. So yeah, the Melbourne Airport journey, and again, this is probably something that we probably can't pick up from 2016 when we originally started the project, and felt that we should go back to the beginning really and look back at when Melbourne Airport was constructed and built back in the late 1960s. Again, you probably see from that image, there's not much of an airport there at that particular time, but you start to see the bones being constructed during the process of this. So you can see in the foreground here, the plinths built for the elevated departures drive, which we'll go into more detail later on. But it gives you a kind of a sense of kind of where the airport has come and the journey it's come over the last 50 years. They celebrated their 50th anniversary last year. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we're not too much in terms of celebration, but I'm sure that'll be a belated celebration for the airport. But we wanted to take you through a bit of a timeline really through this space. So when the airport opened in the 1st of July in 1970, it was a pretty major element for Australia and for Melbourne. It was a kind of a coming of age moment really. So it was connecting Melbourne and Australia back to the rest of the world. And so the inclusion of flight and that connectivity really saw the kind of the growth of immigration and people traveling a lot more freely. There's an image that I've got down there on the bottom right is the original Arrivals Hall project, which is a lovely solid clad timber walled finish, which has got everyone there waiting for their kind of new loved ones and friends and family that have been overseas. And again, it was the Melbourne Airport became a really great place to be. Obviously, I wasn't there at the time, but from the kind of the people I spoke to that were there, and again, there's an immense level of pride that the airport has, and it started from the moment that it opened. Moving briefly through into the 1970s and into the 80s, as air travel became more accessible for more and more people, the demand for flights obviously increased, which obviously led to the demand and increase in the capacity and physical service that Melbourne Airport could bring. So there's a small snippet image there you've got from the 1980s of a very, very busy Arrivals Hall. So it's just good to kind of frame that. The actual hall itself was located in the what is now the T2 baggage hall. So we'll go over that a little bit later on, but we start to see incremental growth of the terminal over these years. And then moving into the 90s and 1990s, during the privatization of the airport, demand was obviously ever increasing, and there were some significant expansions, mainly on the air side for the international pier, but also this also led to new security services. And so the Arrivals Hall was pushed out of its original location and then relocated underneath that elevated departures drive, which I spoke about earlier. This starts to lead to that incremental growth of a terminal to meet the demand. And during the late 90s and the early 2000s, the hall essentially has been in a kind of a still state in which it's not really it hadn't really expanded any much further than the last 15-20 years, but demand was increasing dramatically, and the year-on-year growth, obviously pre-COVID, was huge, and so the airport needed to look at the ideas of upgrading and providing capacity increases in this space. So Grimshaw were engaged during 2013-14 to look at a terminal-wide master plan, which looked at significant growth, both landside in this area here and airside, and the kind of the international offering that would be befitting to an international terminal. From this project, there are several key priority projects that were highlighted, one of which was the 8-3 claim expansion of the international hall, which we completed in 2017, but also it was the arrivals hall project. So the brief that we were set from Melbourne Airport during this stage was to be more of a short-term approach due to the immediate need for expansion and physical space, but also understanding that there is a long-term master plan and a long-term vision. So this is one major stepping stone in meeting that ultimate condition. But also to start to create a sense of arrival again. I think over the last 15-20 years, not much had been looked at in terms of the refreshness of the airport, and the city has won kind of the most livable city for many years, and so the airport international front door kind of probably needed to catch up with those kind of conversations. So it was really important for everyone involved to kind of create an identity and a welcome to Melbourne and a goodbye from Melbourne. This included some technical and operational improvements in wayfinding and in orientation, understanding the limiting nature in which we could expand and grow the terminal physically. So adding that level of legibility and clarity was really important. It's also good to touch on that the international and domestic terminals weren't so much connected from an internal space from the land side. And so that was something that the airport was keen to explore, is to look at creating that much more passenger comfort for passengers that are transferring from international and domestic flights, so they don't need to kind of leave one terminal and then walk back into another one. So adding that passenger journey at the forefront of the brief. And if there's any opportunities to increase and to optimize the retail offering from the international land side, then it's something that we're also keen to explore. So there's a few factors I want to touch on in terms of the then existing conditions of the arrivals hall. There's some limiting spatial qualities in here, but also, which I'll talk about later, but also during peak hours, became immensely congested and disorientating, mainly because of the way in which you would exit from the security area on the left-hand side of your image. There's essentially two doors there, both very much at the end of each part of the arrivals hall, and so it was a kind of a guessing game on which door that your colleagues or your friends and family were going to exit from. So there was TV screens that were up there that had screens of the other door, so it was kind of like you were watching two screens at the same time. So it was quite a confusing space, and especially during peak hours. So that adding that legibility, wayfinding, and navigation was really important. And as you can probably see from this image, there's not a tremendous amount of natural daylight into the hall, and especially towards the back of the hall. So a lot of people that have been flying internationally have been on long haul flights. They've come 20 odd hour flights, and so they arrive, and the scale of the space was probably not what they probably anticipated when they've flown from other international airports in Europe and beyond. And again, touching back on the elevated road and departures drive that sits above. So physically and structurally, this sits independent from the terminal. So it's something that we weren't able to use to our advantage in terms of structural integrity. So everything that we've done in this space has been structurally independent from the elevated road above. I tip my cap to our colleagues at ACOM, who are the structural engineers, who had to do quite a bit of gymnastics to make what we did work. But also the interfacing elements of the airport and understanding that there's a full operating forecourt that sits adjacent to the terminal, and that connection was not really there in the previous the condition, because as you can see on the left hand side, you've got back painted glass where all the retail units are, so there's no visual connection in where people are meant to be walking to or to the outside world, essentially. So that's something that we were keen to look at during the design of the project. So this is just an existing plan from 2016, just touching on those comments I said in terms of exiting from the reclaim hall through border force security and into the arrivals hall, where all your meeters and greeters will be located. As you can see, that the waiting areas were split by a rather large unit of retail and tourism here. We also have got the existing structure from the road above, but also we aren't able to extend too far through to the forecourt due to the operating nature of the airport. So it was a highly constrained site, both from we wouldn't be able to extend outwards to gain any more capacity, but what we were able to explore was possibly the extensions into the nodes in which we coin, which is the T3 node to the left or the T2, T1 node to the right-hand side. And those are towards your T1 Qantas terminal or your T3 Virgin terminal for domestic flights. And a quick section just looking at the the volumetrics of the space that we had to work in as well. There was a small extension in the late 1990s and early 2000s of a small canopy area with a clear story window, which is the only window that provided you natural daylight throughout that space. And again, not being able to touch too much in terms of the departures drive due to the structural nature of that project, it would have been cost prohibitive to even attempt to try to remove that during this project. So to answer the brief from the client to add capacity to a design but without extending it too far was a real challenge for us, but we were really keen to take that on board. So I'll touch on a couple of the items that we and some of the design moves that we did. And again, the first one we looked at was centralizing and consolidating that exit from the baggage hall and the secondary examination area, and where people congregate, and trying to add that little bit of legibility into that space. And I'll touch on the increase in footprint toward the T3, T2 node, and understanding that connectivity between domestic and international terminals was really important for the airport. And then looking at the material treatments and intuitive wayfinding, as Kalani mentioned, not just for those who want to redesign, but also looking at how we can introduce more natural and softer material palette into those areas and where people dwell and where people need to make a decision, starting to bring some of that language through into the terminal. And again, looking at the opportunity to possibly upgrade some of the retail offerings in that space. So one of the major moves was to create a central core area. So what we ended up doing is we removed that existing retail block, pushed it to the sides, the north and the south of the airport, of the arrivals hall, and gained the maximum amount of depth that we could in the central area of the terminal. And what we introduced is a balustrading corralling area where we can we can guide passengers and people through to a central area where it's easier to see from a central location. You can see both doors, you can see where people are walking to. So it takes that edge of anxiety or that have I missed my family who've walked out the other door and I've gone this way. It's all about that opportunity to try to add clarity and excitement, because this is a really powerful moment. Like, the people and family and friends have been flying over for 20 hours and you probably haven't seen it for a long time, and so wanting to make that drama and that welcome to Melbourne as exciting as we possibly could. And just some small moves that we made using the existing conditions, but we felt that once we look at the final product, that it was a really big change for us from a design perspective, and just moving structure slightly back to kind of maximize the amount of daylight that we can get through that clear story really has impact on that space. And yeah, Goshi will touch more in terms of materiality choice and articulation. Moving into the T3, T2 node, this is the area in which we were essentially building underneath the elevated road, but also trying to connect to 20, 30, 40 years of expansion, but also to try and tie them together in this uniform piece of architecture. There was a high level of complexity in terms of additional VT that we located, that we had to sew in between the terminal and the road. So there wasn't much margin of error here, and so by doing so, we were able to kind of to improve that passenger journey from the forecourt level, but also from an elevated level coming from other areas of the terminal. And again, it gives the opportunity to improve the kind of the visual aspect and transparency by creating a brand new facade area in this location. But the key moments along the project, we wanted to make sure that there was a really good material palette in terms of natural finishes, texture, warmth, more so than anything else. So the inclusion of some soft curvature in the plasterboard panels and the curvature of the wall beyond. We know, and we were very, very aware that people will be brushing up against these materials and these surfaces. So we wanted to add that level of craft and detail, which Gosh will touch on later on. But it was really important for us that this project was scalable, but also it kind of add that level of that tactile nature for the passengers and staff that are in the space. And that was both throughout the whole design of the project, trying to maximize daylight, trying to make sure that there's a kind of a critical mass area where people can congregate and sit and wait and dwell and kind of build that level of excitement of seeing their friends and family. But while we're doing this project, we're also working in parallel with the airport as the design vision guide. So this was setting out the principles and the kind of the look and feel of the airport holistically. And so it was a really great moment to be involved with, because we were developing the project, but also we were developing these design principles and this kind of inherent Melbourne approach. So it gave us the opportunity to apply that thinking into this project, and it was great to work together with the airport in both scales. So I'll hand over to Goshi now, and Goshi will be able to take you through some of the customer journey and the design progression.
Thank you, Dean. So the coming this slide sort of shows the summary of the key moves that we developed in collaboration with the rest of our design team and with the close kind of working with APAM. And it actually it did take us some time. So as Dean mentioned earlier, we started working on the redevelopment of the T2 arrivals in 2016. And the team that I led kind of took over in the latter part of 2018 and was tasked with the development of a final evolution of the design, but as well, at last, the tender documentation to get it delivered. And here we're seeing all these key moves. Again, I'm just summarize what Dean was talking about. So rearrangement of if you go back just for a second, rearrangement of the main entrance arrangements, the vertical transportation, and obviously the key landmark airside point of exit, and the waiting zone, sort of kind of, creating a more sort of a better holistic experience for both arriving passengers and those waiting. And we sort of created a series of features that highlight those key touch points and highlight these narratives that we developed with the rest of the design team. So the mentioned before design guide provided us the backdrop palette, sort of key palette that we incorporated into the design, but obviously as we went through it, we sort of developed it further in more detail and more specific and more kind of precise selection of material that could sort of befit the sort of prestige, I guess, of this space, because T2 arrival halls is probably one of the most sort of iconic spaces for airport, because it's that doorway to Melbourne, doorway to Victoria, doorway to Australia. In this palette, you can see the key features were timber and anodized aluminium, golden anodized aluminium, that was then featured in our entry portals. So as a part of broader wayfinding strategy for the Melbourne Airport, the Bureau has developed a wayfinding strategy, and part of them are these yellow portals. Each of the terminals kind of interpreted in its own way, depending on the, I guess, status of each of the terminals, the T2 being the most important one, in a sense, the hierarchy out of them all. We kind of wanted to kind of give it a better, more sort of befitting craft and materiality. So we've chosen to go with anodized aluminium, sort of more like gold, and it's highlighted with the lighting, which sort of approach has been developed with Bureau North as well. So if you go to a bit more detail design, so you can see we try to make that, there is a careful attention to how the detail was folded and how the lighting is incorporated. So it creates something that is quite special and creates that kind of point of entry and point of interest as you're traveling through the terminal, and it gives you a very clear cue where to go. And to get there, we actually took quite a bit of time to develop the mock-ups. We've run through a series of different tests to test out how the materials joins, how the materials wrap around, how the lighting is fitted, what the warmth or temperature of the lighting is, how the surrounding facade joins and interfaces with it, just to make sure that the attention to detail as people kind of travel through and they're very close to those elements, it's actually befits the kind of a prestige of the space. And then, so the facade in which those portals were set, we wanted to make sure that it is simple, it's clean and elegant, but also has that kind of level of attention to detail, a little bit of a fuss, a little bit of an interest, that when you come closer, because people do stay in those spaces for quite some time, especially when they wait, and they can have that point of interest and they can touch the facade, touch the fixing. So it was as well a little bit of a moment of joy as you're passing through that. That as well was an interesting process, a lot of fun that we had with the builder, just to going through developing through the mock-ups to make sure that we choose the right texture, right color, right temperature, right finish of the anodized aluminium bosses, and obviously the right nuts, because the nuts are very visible. And the other, obviously, the big element that it's the most visible is the timber, and the key sort of touch points of the terminal were highlighted as in this timber features, both with the walls, with the iconic Melbourne wall as a main player, but also the ceilings where you kind of main interfaces, the sort of main transport nodes, but also the waiting areas, but not forgetting amenities and information pods, because amenities are actually a very important part of the terminal. I always remember that after spending quite a lot of time detailing every single part of it. So the timber we worked on this strategy, and I think Kalani has mentioned that before in her presentation, how important the importance ability to use timber as a sort of this feature that highlights these key points of choice points of the journey. That was a very important part of the wayfinding strategy that Bureau North and us developed together, and there was a very great close collaboration to sort of fully crafting those details, how those information pieces can be integrated into the timber, into the environment, and including the obviously the selection of the right timber. We were lucky that we have such a beautiful timber in Australia, so we were able to find the beautiful native timber that is spotted gum, that's got enough variety, the warmth and the durability to be suitable for this sort of application, because people will, we don't want it to be highly needed to be maintained very frequently, but wanted to have that kind of richness, color and durability that can last for however it needs to. And so then going to this fun bit of design. So this was, as I mentioned before, the design collaboration with Bureau North, how to integrate the lighting, but then the joy of designing this and trying to think how we can execute it, because when you look at it, it looks incredibly complex. And we worked, our internal team figured out how to incorporate our capabilities, design technology capabilities, and parametric design into simplifying the documentation to just 2 drawings. One that shows the key details and the transition between the kind of bump in a timber that is able to take the light inset, and a spreadsheet that basically made the whole delivery of it a lot simpler, but as well, it didn't blow up our documentation to uncertain proportions. And then obviously there was a lot of refinement to the design for the prototype. So, we worked with Sculptform to figure out how those bumps in a timber can be created, and then how we can incorporate the lighting, what temperature of that light should be, how that light should be fitted, because people will come really close with this element, so we wanted to make sure that it's really right and it's really beautiful. The other part, obviously, we've seen in these big images initially were the ceilings. The ceilings are kind of, we use them sort of as a orientation spaces and sort of to highlight the touch points. And because the big infrastructure project always have huge amount of services set within the ceilings, and there is obviously a lot of maintenance required, so there'll be some access panels. The 2 big challenges were how we incorporate those services, but also how we create those gentle, soft curves with the rectilinear material. So this, again, we did through a series of mock-ups, and it took us a little bit of time to get it nailed down, but it was definitely worth it. I think we had ended up, I don't know, Dean, whether you remember, I think it ended up in 3 series of different mock-ups to get where we got to. Yeah, but it's definitely worth it, and Dean can show us how the implementation of all this detailing that the team did, how that all eventuated, and what other interesting stories he had on the way.
Thank you, Gosha. So it's probably good to note that we started the construction of the arrivals hall just before COVID struck. And so the original was, how are we going to build this expansion in a fully operational airport, and especially a fully operational international airport? But this is probably the kind of the only thinnest silver lining that I could possibly say, was that it allowed the terminal to have no passengers in there, so it allowed the contractor a bit more free rein to construct the design without too many people scurrying around them. So I think it was a bit of a saving grace for them in terms of the construction, because it was a very complex construction process. So just a collection of images from site, and again, the construction of the materiality and the timber patterns. Like any project that's building and interfacing with existing conditions, you can prepare and you can draw as much as you want, but as soon as you get on site, things do change quite quickly. So it is good to note that kind of it was a great experience to go through again with the airport to build such an expansion that connected so many different elements together. And so we were working together through the whole process. But you start to see some of the kind of the finer details that Gosha mentioned in the final execution. And again, the portals and the way that they were executed, working together with more transparent glazing, and again using those wash of light rather than the directionality of the light, using softer colors, expressing these thresholds to make sure that it's easier for people to understand which way that they're walking, which way they are orientating through the space. But also some of these low ceiling heights, adding that level of interest and articulation into the material choice and the design of those details. Again, the actual welcome wall, the Melbourne wall, was probably the quickest part of the construction. Really, it clicked on quite quickly, to be honest, and it was hidden behind hoarding for quite a while. So as soon as the hoarding came down, you're able to step back and see it. It was pretty amazing moment for us all, especially those who've been involved in the design through the years. So it was a great moment. And yeah, let's go through some of the final images. So this image here is in the original T2, T3 node, which is essentially an external space prior to this project. So it really does start to kind of provide that kind of world-class international airport arrival and arrival journey, but also connecting the airport in a much more sophisticated manner, providing elements of wayfinding and legibility through the space. But as you can see, just the way that the image is layered up with the kind of the texture from the ecotone panels through to the timber on the soffit to the timber at the back of the wall, looking at scale and repetition was really important, and understanding where people will view these signs and the way that they cannot be articulated. But these are some really nice moments in which we captured in terms of how we framed these elements. Wash of light coming down from the arrivals hall above, departures hall above was really nice, and starting to get that kind of visual and physical connection through the spaces. And you'll probably note that most of these images, there's hardly anyone in there, but so it was very eerie when we were going through this process, especially when we were taking the professional photographs. As you can probably see, there are one or two people in there, but they are Grimshaw staff, so they were the only people we could find for us to be able to at least put some people within the space. But we were really happy with the way that it was executed in the final product, and it was great to see it come together, albeit slightly disrupted, but it was a pretty impressive piece of construction by the contractor, working together with so many different existing conditions, but making the space something brand new without expanding into too many different areas. And just some close-ups of some of the detailing of some of the lettering and the kind of the Melbourne wall. Again, it came up really well, and we're really happy with it. This image for me is really important, and I think it just shows the kind of the step change in which the space is, and for those who will be able to experience it in the future. But just by moving those retail units out and taking that back painted glass off and providing that kind of connection to nature and connection to outside, it really has transformed the space. Being able to see trees as soon as you exit from the space is really impressive and really nice, and it adds that natural element in which we wanted the design to kind of start to evoke. And the one thing that we found when we were designing it, and again, it's always something that's always nice when something's not been designed but is an amazing experience, and something that noted, because we've opened up that transparency through to the facade during the evening and during dusk, you can read the Melbourne and the illumination of the Melbourne wall from across the other side of the forecourt. So it provides a brand new vista which we didn't originally anticipate when we were going through the design. So it was a quite lovely moment for us to see that, and yeah, it was great. I'd just like to close us off by just going back through that journey, really, through the airport, and from the 70s and that timber wall, going through to the 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s, and I just wanted to go from very social media-esque style, but I thought it'd be quite apt for a 21st century international airport, was how it started and how it's going. So before we take any questions, just like to thank all of our consultants that we were working with along the way. There was Bureau North, there was LCI, there was Mackenzie's, there was ACOM, there was many others that I may not have mentioned at the moment. But first and foremost, we'd also like to thank Melbourne Airport for providing us and entrusting us with their front door. And we just hope that we've done it justice for you. Thank you very much.
I think you've definitely done it justice, Dean. We will just close this presentation off and open up to some questions. Now, just a reminder to everyone to pop all your questions in the questions tab on the right-hand side. There is some bubblies and a hamper up for grabs, so definitely make sure you ask some questions. I have a question for you both to start things off. It's a bit of a light-hearted one. Where are you both travelling first?
Home.
Fair enough.
I already traveled through it. So I've traveled to, I was very lucky. I was probably one of our first team that managed to travel through international arrivals. I went to Auckland earlier in the year. I was, whenever the bubble opened, so exciting. I took obviously a selfie in front of the wall.
I can imagine it would have been great coming
Yeah,
arriving.
it was. I think I called Dean as well. I kind of spoke to Dean on it and showed him on the
I think
face.
you sent me a selfie, Gosha.
Yeah, I did actually. It was very exciting. And I think especially that we waited for so long for it. I mean, it's anticipation because we worked on it, but also because at last we were able to travel. So it was a beautiful, it's a really lovely experience. It's a much more enhanced experience to get.
That's awesome. We can't wait to see your selfie, Dean, when you arrive home. So next question we have is, how did you go about deciding which elements or materials were uniquely Melbourne as called by the client's brief?
Good question. Gosha, do you want me to have that or
We can sort of tag team. I think the part of the design guide was it was a critical part of that development and defining that palette, the very Melbourne but very Australian palette as well. Obviously, being lucky to have an Indigenous timber that is part of it's obviously the best expression of the local palette. Do you want to add something to it?
No, look, I think that's a really good question, and again, it's something that we also spoke about at length when we were going through the design vision guide and looking at the kind of the cultural influence of Melbourne, but also the kind of the physical influence of Melbourne. And again, the resonating was the warmth of timber and the use of of natural materials. So we kind of looked at using as many natural materials as we could do in a space that's highly constrained from fire ratings, from performance, from hardwaring, from durability, all of that. So usually it's something that we are keen to explore. Sometimes there's quite a long process for us to get certain products through to completion as well.
Thank you. A question that kind of relates back to that as well is interesting to see timber heavily used in the initial design in 1970. Did that influence your design choice to use timber elements as part of the key feature of the redevelopment? I'm
going to say yes, but it is something that we did through our through our research. We're really taken by some of the kind of the early 1970s works, especially some of the kind of the planting and the kind of the excessive external plazas that they had during the original terminal. So the idea of bringing some of the essence and the identity that the terminal had from its original opening was something that we're very conscious of. So it's almost a modern interpretation of that.
It's great to see the before and after of that. Absolutely. Another one we have is, how did you do the design? Who did you do the lighting design with?
So our lighting designer was done by ACOM, but we collaborated also closely with Iguzzini, and then special others on, for example, on the integrated components for the portals and the timber feature walls. That was we kind of work closely with the suppliers to fully understand what specific fittings would work the best with this, because it's a very precise sort of crafting. You need to know not just the overall strategy, what you do with the lighting designers, but quite a specific products that you can integrate into this component. So that was lots of fun as well, and we've learned a lot along the way.
That's great. While we're on the topic of materials, there is another question here that is the material finishes, selections and visual aesthetic appeal is visual in a tactile sense. Was consideration given to the acoustic amenity within the arrival hall and installed audio system to enhance audio sensory wayfinding for visually impaired personnel?
Yeah, well, and Dean, you can add to it as well, but the batten ceilings and batten walls, obviously you've got that added value that because they're batten, they've got gaps in between behind it, we can put acoustic insulation, because obviously in those big, large public spaces, there's a lot of hard surfaces where they need to be easily maintained and can't be tampered with by the public or played with by the public. So we're kind of limited to where we can put acoustic attenuation. So yes, we included the acoustic attenuation within the ceilings, and as well the big feature white metal perforated ceiling head that was fully acoustically treated too. So the acoustic insulation was applied to the underside of the bridge, actually. And then when you see the images of those node points, that's probably the most obvious one. We had a series of speakers that kind of helped with the sort of public announcements speakers. So and they were both integrated in the feature ceilings and in the sort of metal ceiling that was applied to underside of the bridge.
Awesome. So we have another one relating to timber. We're not doing this on purpose. Were there any concerns with the use of timber from a fire perspective in that area?
That was raised when we first started to explore timber, but through our fire engineering consultant and through testing and through that was quite a straightforward process, knowing that it would be group 3 and just making sure that it met the standards. So
there's the spotted wood is actually quite because it's a hardwood timber that's got better qualities as well. So it was definitely a consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another one here, which is redesigning and redeveloping existing structures always presents a unique set of challenges. Were there any particular items that were particularly restraining in your design?
Gosh, shall I jump on this one?
You can. I mean, I can share my frustration with that, because it was an incredibly difficult process. I mean, I think initially when we were planning this project, we obviously needed to maintain the arrivals hall functional. So that was an interesting one. How to stage fully functioning arrivals hall with the construction and safety and all sorts of elements. But as well as we're going through it, we were sort of discovering new dimensions or new elements that were hidden or not documented, and the levels didn't quite lined up. So we kind of had to make a lot of very quick decisions and work very closely with the construction team to make sure that we adjust and tune the design as we go along. And particularly the road, I think, the road and the gutters of that road, they were the biggest challenge.
Yeah, it's, again, probably a way to put it as well is that we've got an existing road that you can't touch in terms of you can't take any structural support off. You've got tunnels that are running underneath your feet with almost a few 100 mil gap. So there's not much in terms of foundations that we could lay in some of these areas. There's major power cables through that space as well. And there's also another 2 terminals that we're connecting that have 3 or 4 different structural strategies in there. So we were sewing this expansion into an existing environment that was probably not there for it to be sewn into. So the one thing that I felt was quite interesting and quite impressed by is that we did actually sew 2 new VTs in between what was the only place you could put new escalators in that space. And so just trying to adapt and that challenge was really important for us, but we feel that we've done it justice.
With the great help of structural team, they had to
Absolutely.
do some interesting gymnastics there. The ACOM team, definitely. That's hats off to them.
I think hats off to you all. You did a phenomenal job, and it's really great to see the design come to life. And I know I'm very excited to get to the airport. I will wrap up the Q&A there and hand over to Kate to take us through the rest of the presentation. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Kalani, and thank you very much to you guys for presenting. I think, Gosha, you won't be the only one with a selfie in front of that Melbourne sign. I think when people start traveling, especially when they start seeing their family and loved ones and friends after a very, very long time, there's going to be very many happy selfies being taken in front of that sign. So thank you very much for presenting. We really enjoyed that story. I'm just going to draw out our lucky draw winner. I have Yo, and apologies if I'm not pronouncing correct, Yao Chong. If you could let us know if you're still here online, we will drop you an email afterwards and grab your details to send you out a nice little pack. Now we will wrap up this presentation. We'll leave you with a short little video of the Melbourne Airport. And to Din's comments, it does look a little bit eerie with almost nobody in there. The usual images of airport are more like the original ones with large crowds, which, to be honest, at the moment seem very, very much like a thing of the past, but fingers crossed we will get back to it. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And we will part on that. Thanks very much.